Annals of the Closing Market, a chronicle of the years when the world learned war was an option. The mechanical collapse, timeline of economic failure. Year 12 to 8, the long compression. The decade before rupture is characterized by rising concentration and financial engineering. Corporate architectures become pyramids of claims rather than productive firms. Equity is concentrated in a handful of holding entities that manage global supply hubs. Public revenue stagnates while social transfer obligations increase. Warnings by technocrats about systemic risk are dismissed as rumors from the professors. Year 7 to 5, supply fragility disclosed. A single catastrophic cyber attack on a transnational shipping registry, compounded by climate-driven harvest failures across multiple latitudes, exposes the brittleness of global provisioning. Lean logistics are revealed to be brittle. Insurance premiums spike, but the market is thin. Sovereign borrowers are forced to repurpose reserves to stabilize currency rather than to replenish stockpiles. Year 4 to 2, fiscal exhaustion and political recklessness. Emergency fiscal measures, debt holidays, temporary caps on interest, are enacted piecemeal and then folded into larger legal frameworks that privilege bondholders. Public works are deferred. Governments increasingly resort to non-transparent credit lines and off-book guarantees. The populace watches austerity beside conspicuous corporate bailouts. Protests proliferate. Labor actions shut down ports and refineries. Political actors increasingly frame the crisis as a fight for survival rather than as a solvable disorder. Year 1, the shock year. A cascade of sovereign defaults, a major energy pipeline rupture, and a wide bank run converge. Currencies across large territories depreciate. Food riots spread from metropolitan centers to provincial towns. A government paper, leaked and then retracted, calculates that public hunger will rise sharply in 6 months absent extraordinary measures. To the intellectual and moral argument, how war was narrated into legitimacy. The rhetoric of necessity. Political speeches shift from promising reform to pronouncing emergency. We face a choice between national survival and gradual decay. The grammar changes. What were previously political problems become existential questions of biosurvival. When scarcity becomes framed as an existential threat, measures that circumvent ordinary politics acquire a veneer of moral urgency. The doctrine of extraversion. Intellectuals and policy wonks supply a doctrine. If domestic capital cannot be reconstituted, then the state must secure external sources, energy fields, grain belts, mineral deposits. The doctrine's logic is simple. External resources, obtained quickly and at scale, restore domestic provisioning faster than domestic production can be rebuilt. The doctrine is presented in technocratic graphs showing time to restoration under various scenarios. The shortest projected path always involves seizure or control of foreign nodes. The moral shelter of scarcity. When citizens are hungry, leaders argue, ordinary moral prohibitions relax. Propaganda frames proposed action as triage, hard choices for a sick polity. Ethical debate is replaced by arithmetic, lost calories versus legal niceties. This arithmetic, repeated in controlled media and in select academic posts, normalizes extreme measures as the only humane option in the face of imminent death. 3. Institutional mutations, how organizations rewired themselves toward force. Emergency architecture and the shrinking of deliberation. A small set of continuity councils is empowered to act without full parliamentary oversight. Their charters, initially temporary, are extended repeatedly. Oversight committees are starved of staff. The veneer of legality remains while the substantive checks vanish. Judges are told that rulings would risk market panic. Privatization of coercion and the rise of contracted force. Corporate security arms and private logistic contractors, already embedded in ports and supply chains, are given expanded authorities to secure critical infrastructure. These forces, paid from defense budgets and commercial security lines, operate under commercial confidentiality. The formal military's role is recast as one limb within a larger public-private security complex. The breakdown of labor-state bargains. Long-standing pacts, unions' rights in return for productivity concessions, fray. Governments, desperate to keep key nodes running, bypass collective bargaining with decrees. Crucial sectors are declared national criticality and taken under direct command. Workers who resist are stigmatized as risking national survival. The social contract is reinterpreted. Compliance is citizenship. Settle the elite calculus. Why those in power chose the path of force. Loss aversion and the premium on quick fixes. Elites possessing concentrated assets face binary outcomes. Either a slow, redistributive unwinding that may dissolve their claims, or a rapid reordering that preserves wealth, albeit in a new configuration. Under loss aversion, they prefer the rapid, high-risk option, even if it carries great moral and long-term costs. The fear of revolutionary spillover. Decision-makers see patterns from history. Prolonged deprivation breeds insurrection. Empowered by private militias and external allies, they calculate that projecting force outward might forestall internal revolution by redirecting energies and consolidating narrative control. A country in external conflict can be more governable internally. The specter of contagion among polities. When regional powers face the same structural pressures, some actors adopt preemptive logic. Securing key resources before competitors do becomes defense. In such a setting, defensive war is argued to be preventive, a logic that persuades many, especially when framed as securing life-sustaining goods. V. The mobilization of consent, how populations were prepared. Propaganda and the manufacture of threat. State and allied media create a coherent story. Scarcity has an external cause. Foreign actors seek to weaponize shortages against the nation, and only decisive action will prevent collapse. Media cycles center images of empty store shelves and lines at soup kitchens, juxtaposed with archival footage of foreign leaders and infrastructure. The narrative is simple and emotive, engineered to flatten nuance and create urgency. Rituals of unity and the suppression of doubt. Public ceremonies, torchlit supply redistributions, televised mobilization oaths, national labor duty parades, replace pluralistic debate. Dissent is framed as indulgent or malicious. Critics are pressured into either silence or exile. The social price of dissent rises, converting private skepticism into public conformity. Institutional coercion as consent builder. By combining incentives, priority rations for those who register as national support workers, with penalties, fines, and administrative blacklists for those who refuse, authorities coerce behavior in a way that simulates consent. Many citizens comply, not out of deep conviction, but out of immediate material self-preservation. Charles I strikes. How political calculations became military reality. Blockades, seizures, and coercive acquisition. The narrative culminates in actions nominally presented as seizures of stranded assets or vital supply nodes. A port is blockaded. A remote oil field is seized by contract security under the legal cover of temporary trusteeship. Each action escalates disputes with neighbors and with multinational firms. Violent enforcement, initially targeted, soon expands to protect logistics. Tit for tat and the spiral of escalation. Adversaries respond. Satellites of influence intervene. Trade corridors are threatened. Sanctions, embargoes, and expeditionary raids proliferate. Each retaliatory measure weakens the possibility of negotiated settlement because it makes the costs of reversal appear unbearable to those who have already mobilized. The illusion of quick gain. Early seizures sometimes yield temporary windfalls. Seized reserves are diverted to urban centers. Short-term public discontent abates. Success in isolated operations reinforces the belief among decision-makers that force can indeed be an instrument of repair. That illusion proves corrosive because what is temporary becomes institutionalized. 7. The war of attrition, how conflict and economic failure feed each other. Destruction of productive capacity. Military operations target transport networks and energy nodes that were already under strain from the original market failures. Reconstruction is impossible without stability. Stability is impossible with continuing seizures. The war becomes both cause and effect of deeper economic retrogression. The collapse of networks and the rise of black markets. As formal supply chains break, ad hoc markets emerge. Contraband networks, wartime profiteers, and decentralized extractive operations gain prominence. Parallel economies entrench power among those who control violence and supply, deepening inequality. Humanitarian catastrophe and moral erosion. Civilians suffer from food insecurity, interrupted healthcare, displacement, and the collapse of basic public services. The moral and civic bonds that once underpinned collective life fray. Where solidarity might have offered alternatives, fear and survival instincts dominate, making non-violent reconstruction politically costly and socially fragile. Fate, dissent, resistance, and the shrinking of alternatives. Non-violent resistance, attempts and repression. Many actors resist by strikes, occupations, and mass civil disobedience aimed at blocking the machinery of war. These movements achieve notable temporary victories, disrupting logistics, exposing corruption, but are met with severe repression. Emergency tribunals, administrative deprivation, and public delegitimization. The fragmentation of opposition. Opponents disagree among themselves about strategy. Some favor negotiated truces, others clandestine armed resistance. Fragmentation allows wartime authorities to justify harsher measures, claiming that negotiated engagement would reward violence. The international community's dilemma. External actors hesitate. Intervention risks broader conflagration, while inaction is a moral failing. Sanctions intended to punish elites often exacerbate civilian suffering. Diplomatic efforts are hampered by mistrust and by the doctrine that casts the conflict as a matter of survival rather than of policy mismanagement. Saints, aftermath and lessons. The cost of treating war as the only answer. Material and institutional losses. Infrastructure that took generations to build is damaged beyond easy repair. Institutions that might have mediated compromise, courts, free press, assembly structures, are weakened or captured. Wealth is redistributed away from broad-based productivity toward those who aligned with coercion and supply control. The moral catastrophe. Communities that once drew sustenance from reciprocal obligations now experience deep mistrust. The ethical fabric of the polity is rent. Younger generations learn that force is a viable path to distribution, normalizing violence as a tool of governance. The paradox of temporary gains and enduring loss. Short-term access to resources does not equate to long-term regeneration. Occupations and seizures cannot replace the complex process of rebuilding productive capacity, restoring international trust, and fostering human capital. What was won in the moment is lost in the decades that follow. Testimonies, voices from the archive, fictional excerpts. We all cheered when the first convoy crossed the border. The markets filled for 2 weeks. Then the ration cards were reissued, only to registered defense workers. My neighbor, a nurse, lost access to the medicine she needed because her ID barcode did not match a list. We had the goods, but we had also lost the rights that ensured they would be shared. Anonymous urban hospital worker. They told us the seizure was temporary. They told us it was necessary. When the port returned to national administration, private contracts were simply rewritten. A year later, those who had owned the terminals were part of the new governing council. Trade union organizer. I was in the continuity council. We believed we were buying our grandchildren time. We did not understand that the time we bought would require perpetual enforcement. We thought emergency powers would be a bridge. Instead, they were a scaffold for a new system. Former official testimony to the Commission on Post-Crisis Reconstruction. Term method, why the idea took hold. Psychological and structural underpinnings. Cognitive shortcuts in crisis. In acute crises, populations and leaders rely on heuristics, reduce options, choose decisive action, prefer narratives that explain complex causality in simple terms. If we act swiftly and take supplies, we will avert famine, is a compelling story that simplifies messy political trade-offs into decisive moral action. Institutional lock-in and path dependence. Once institutions start acting under emergency rules, and once private actors reconfigure their incentives, security firms profiting from seizures, banks underwriting survivorship loans, reversal becomes politically and economically expensive. Path dependence locks polities into trajectories where force becomes increasingly embedded. Moral licensing and the erosion of constraints. When leaders justify extraordinary means by extraordinary ends, the door opens to progressive degradation of norms. Each exception begets further exceptions. Over time, what was once unthinkable, cross-border seizures, private militarization, suspension of judicial review, becomes bureaucratically normalized. Set alternatives that were ignored, paths not taken, catalogue and rationale. Coordinated international redistribution. A proposal to coordinate multinational buffer stocks of food and emergency energy, funded by temporary levies on the largest transnational firms, was tabled early and dismissed as politically infeasible. The counter-argument, it requires trust where there is none. That dismissal became self-fulfilling. Large-scale debt, restructuring and public investment. A coalition of creditors might have agreed to phased debt relief in exchange for verifiable investment in local production and job programs. The political cost to elites who profited under the prior regime was deemed too high. Democratic emergency governance. Proposals that tied emergency measures to sunset clauses, empowered independent provisional assemblies, and instituted transparent oversight were quietly shelved in favor of closed councils, citing speed and avoidance of market panic. Third, a record of deeds, selected public documents, summaries. Decree 37, temporary trusteeship of critical nodes. Legal framing allowed the executive to assume operational command over selected ports and energy fields, initially limited to 90 days, renewed repeatedly. Memorandum, Ministry of Finance, risk of social contagion. Recommended reallocation of reserves to defensive procurement and proposed bilateral deals that circumvented open tender. Transcript, Prime Ministerial Address. We shall take what we must to live. The clip was recycled in official channels as a justification for the first external seizures. Fond, postscript, repair, reparation, and the work of remembering. Reconstruction must be political as well as physical. Repairing bridges and ports without resolving the political fractures that produced the conflict will only reconstitute the conditions for future violence. Truth commissions, legally enforced redistribution, and institutional rebuilding must be part of any recovery program. Institutional safeguards are essential. Sunset clauses for emergency powers, enforced transparency for security contracts, legal protections for labor action, and independent channels for food distribution are among the measures that can prevent recurrence. Cultural recovery, relearning nonviolence. Where a generation has learned that force is a political instrument, civic cultures must intentionally rebuild practices of compromise, facilitated dialogues, cross-group labor management councils, and civic education that emphasizes shared fate and legal redress. Epilogue, a register of regrets. Those who in the Chronicle argued for force later wrote apologies or, in rare cases, recorded their regrets with forensic clarity. We rationalized seizure as triage. We failed to see that triage with military tools becomes a system that demands continuous enforcement. The short-term tactical gain turned into a generational strategic failure. The final pages of the imagined archive are filled with pleas from displaced farmers, closed letter manifestos from former union leaders, and the names of children who never returned to school. These are not statistics. They are human names, and their presence in the record is the clearest possible refutation of any claim that war was a legitimate solution.